Just to let you know, this episode deals with the topic of suicide. Welcome to Filmability. My name is Joel Fisher. I'm the author of Filmability, a history of disability in cinema that you can find on Amazon and Kindle and paperback. Welcome if you're listening for the first time, and welcome back if you've listened before. And welcome if you're listening for the show on YouTube. All episodes are now available there, and new ones will be added every Monday. Remember to like and subscribe. I've always wanted to say that. This week's film is Sentimental, the classic Oscar-winning film starring Al Pacino and Chris O'Donnell. Sentimental is a remake of an Italian film directed by Dina Risi called Profumo di Donna, which translates as Sentimental Woman. However, it does take liberties with the characters and the plot to adapt it for an American audience. It's directed by Martin Brest, a director who, before Sentimental Woman, was best known for directing Beverly Hills Cop with Eddie Murphy and Midnight Run with Robert De Niro. After Sentimental Woman, he directed Meet Joe Black with Brad Pitt and Geely with Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez. The screenplay was written by Bo Goldman, and like the original film, was adapted from the novel Il Bo Eo Il Mile, which is translated as The Darkness and Honey, taking inspiration from the characters in Profumo di Donna by crediting Ruggero Macari and Dina Risi as they co-wrote the screenplay for the original film. If you'd like to watch Sentimental Woman, then at the time of recording you can do so by finding it on Netflix and Amazon Prime in the UK. Elsewhere it's able to buy and rent digitally and in physical form. So without further ado, I made a longer than usual introduction. Let's get on with the film. Okay, so I come to a university overlooking some buildings, a bell rings and the students come out of class, and here comes Charlie, played by Chris O'Donnell, and they're looking through the job vacancies on the board, and he finds something for a house sitter, carer for a relative. Outside, some boys see a Jaguar pull up and the teacher gets out. This is Mr. Trask, and he's played by James Rebhorn. The boys are Harry, played by Nicholas Sadler, Trent, played by Todd Luizzo, Jimmy, played by Matt Smith, and George, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman. The boys talk among themselves and they call Mr. Trask a loser, wondering how he got the car. Harry goes up to Mr. Trask and starts sucking up to him. He's complimenting him on the car, and it's just really cruelly. And then Mr. Trask goes to his office with a group of students who are waiting outside. The boys are all talking about their time away. Later on, they have big plans because they come out from rich families. They also ask Charlie what he's doing, and he said he's not sure, and it's implied that he needs the money. Harry then says he's offering drippings to the poor when he's asking Charlie, because despite them being friends, sort of, they know that he's poor. Charlie arrives at a house and a woman opens the door and her children are playing in the hallway. This woman is Karen and she's played by Sally Rossi. She starts talking about her uncle and about how he hated being put in a veterans home. She says that she thinks Frank will like Charlie a lot and that he's the right person for the job. She shouts through the door about Charlie and Frank shouts back angrily. Inside, Charlie and Frank's first meeting isn't going particularly well, and when Charlie finally comes in to see Frank, because they've been talking to each other without seeing each other, but when he sees Frank is sitting in a chair, and he says that he wants to get a closer look at Charlie, even though we know that Frank is blind. Frank pulls himself a glass of Jack and questions Charlie, trying to gauge his intelligence. He asks him about his family and how he can afford to go to the school that he goes to. A child then raps on the window and Frank shouts angrily to get him to go away. He starts to talk about his own family and Charlie makes a smart comment which causes Frank to get angry, asking him about what he wants to do with his life, and Charlie just says he wants the job so he can make enough money to go home for Christmas. Frank puts on some music and ignores Charlie, assuming that he's gone away. But when Charlie doesn't move, Frank dismisses him like Charlie is a soldier. Charlie then goes to see Karen and she says that Frank's bark is worse than his bites and that things will get better. She's bathing her children while they're talking, and her husband, although he doesn't speak, is in the background. Chris is talking to George back at the uni, and outside the other boys are hanging on a lamppost. It's late at night. They're just wandering around. And these boys are doing something they shouldn't be doing. Charlie and George go outside and they see what the boys are doing, and George whistles, asking them what they're doing, because quite frankly it looks very strange. They're up to something. And then an old woman comes up to George and asks what they're doing, and this is Mrs. Hunsaker, and she's played by June Squibb. George then tries to distract her, complimenting her on her coat while the other boys make their escape. The next day Mr. Trask arrives at school, and as he arrives in his car, the boys talk over the tannoy, reciting a poem that they've put together to make fun of him. And then a large balloon inflates outside, picturing Mr. Trask kissing the arse of another teacher. He then reaches out and pops the balloon, which explodes with white paint covering him and the car. Charlie and George are brought into Mr. Trask's office, as he thinks that he knows that who's responsible. He starts talking about the privilege it was to receive that car, and about how great he is, and how he's reached a status because of the car, maybe, or something like that. And he questions Charlie, asking him who did it, and Charlie says he isn't sure. He says there'll be a formal proceeding to settle the matter. George stands up to shake Mr. Trask's hand and wishes him a good Thanksgiving, and he leaves. It seems like he knows who Mr. Trask can get to, so he's going to pick on the weak one. And as he does so, he sits down next to Charlie, and it says he really wants to help put Charlie's name forward as an underprivileged student, and it's basically a bribe to get him to tell him who did it. And when Charlie says he can't, he gives him the weekend to think it over. Outside, George is making fun of Mr. Trask and asks Charlie if he bribed him. Charlie says that he didn't. George says they have to sit together, and George is making sure that Charlie's okay, but you get the impression that he's intimidating him. I mean, this is Philip Seymour Hoffman's breakthrough role. This is the film that made people notice him, and he went on to have a great career. Back at the house, Charlie goes in and to see the family, and on his way to see Frank, Karen's oldest daughter makes fun of Frank by imitating him. She sort of closes her eyes and has a stick in front of her. For a child to imitate him in that way, it just sort of shows how belittled Frank may feel. Charlie goes to see Frank, who's using a phone, and he tells him to pick out some clothes for him. Charlie then asks where they're going, and Frank complains that the family haven't gone yet and that his niece is coming. He complains because she said goodbye 3 times already. You can already see that Frank is not only being belittled by the family, but he also feels like a child being looked after and cared for as if he's an infant, and checked on as if he's a older child who might be doing something he shouldn't be doing. Before she leaves, she tells Charlie not to let Frank use any of the dirty chat lines, and that's who Frank must have been talking to during this scene. Inside, they're getting ready, and Charlie touches Frank's shoulder to guide him around, but Frank turns on him angrily and says he never wants Charlie to touch him, and that if he wants to touch Charlie, then that'll be his choice. He's the blind person in the situation. He doesn't want to be reliant on somebody else. Frank says they're going to New York, and Charlie says he isn't sure, and asks if he should call Karen to make sure that it's okay. But Frank is all set, and as he puts on his dark glasses, he pats Charlie on the back and tells him to walk ahead of him. They start to walk out, but Frank picks up his cat and says goodbye to him, reminding him that when in doubt, just fuck. This is telling the audience that all they need to know about Frank's personality. He's lewd and loud, but he's charming with it. They get to the airport and Charlie grabs Frank's arm. Frank asks Charlie if he's the blind one because he keeps grabbing him, just reinforcing how Frank values his independence. They're on an airplane next and they get some drinks, and Frank's been calling Charlie Chuck the whole time up until this point, and he says he doesn't like it. He says that he prefers to be called Charles, but from now on, Frank just calls him Charlie. It's nice, so it's casual, it's friendly, but, it's still not quite doing exactly what Charles wants him to do. Frank starts talking about women and the beauty of a woman's hair and lips, and he moves on to other body parts. It's nice the way that he's talking about women, how beautiful they are and how much he loves their company. But, he goes into areas where he's just basically objectifying, and I think Al Pacino pulls it off. He's a sort of lovable rogue in a way, but I think it depends on what side you think of Frank's personality. Charlie says that he must like women then, considering the great detail in which Frank has gone into, then it's quite obvious he does like women. But Frank says that women are only a distant second to a Ferrari. In the next scene, they get out of a taxi and they're in New York, and they're at the Waldorf Hotel. They go into a lift and into a hotel room, and Frank tips the bellboy, and Frank then opens the drink cabinet and asks Charlie to tell him what's in there. He then asks where the phone is, and after Charlie gives him the phone, he books a table and a limo. He then gets a small drink flask out of his jacket. Charlie says he needs to go, but Frank insists that they have dinner together, and his driver will take him back at 2200 hours. So this is Charlie. He's still worried about the proceedings that are going to happen later on, but Frank is going to try and relax him and Frank is going to try and show him the finer things in life. In the car, Frank senses that Charlie is unhappy though, and he says that he's worried about getting into trouble because he saw something he shouldn't have done. Frank understands the situation immediately and basically says that he thinks that Charlie is afraid of speaking up, and Frank suggests that Charlie isn't saying anything because he wants to be a rich big shot like his friends, but Charlie denies it. Inside the restaurant, Frank gets Charlie to read the menu, and he starts talking about the food, and Frank asks him about the alcohol. Charlie then asks how he can afford all this. I mean, you get to this point and you think, why haven't you said this before? But Frank says that he saved up his disability checks. Frank then says he lied about being able to get Charlie back to uni, and that he needs somebody to stick around because he's going to make the most of what he has. And in the hotel room, he's going to kill himself. And the waiter comes up and takes their order, and Frank starts talking about the bedrolls. Charlie then asks if he heard Frank right, because that's a bit of a shocking thing to just drop on somebody, especially somebody you barely know. But Frank confirms that he is going to end his life, and then he just casually asks the waiter for a Jack and Coke. Back at the hotel room, Frank tells Charlie what's going to happen, and Charlie salutes sarcastically, but Frank senses that he's doing that and tells him how to salute properly, really puts him in his place and says that better men have saluted him than Charlie. And this is something I should bring up because it's a common cliche of cinema. The idea that a blind person is able to perceive something when a sighted person thinks that they shouldn't is often wrong and exaggerated. Yes, there is a certain level of awareness that all people have on whether they're being watched or not, but a blind person is no more aware of exactly what a person is doing than a person who can see who has their back turned. It's meant to show that Frank doesn't take flaws gladly and will confront them if he thinks he's not getting the proper respect. But it gives the audience the impression that all blind people have extrasensory perception, and they don't. The next morning Frank is singing to himself. Charlie wakes up from laying on a couch and he sees that Frank is being fitted for a new suit by a tailor. He suggests that Charlie get a new suit too, but Charlie turns him down. Charlie says he wants to make a call and he goes into Frank's bedroom to make the call, but Frank angrily tells him to stay out of his room. Charlie makes a call in the room and he talks to George on the phone, and when he's done, Frank makes fun of George, saying that his father must be a rich, important man and his name is probably George Sr. That kind of, very close-knit, rich families where they all look after each other. Frank says he should tell Mr. Trask what he knows so that he can stay among the rich students like he thinks that Charlie wants to do. Otherwise he'll end up poor. And then Frank insists that the tailor make Charlie a suit and he leaves the room. And next thing they get to a house, Frank's nephew opens a door and he's named Randy and he's played by Bradley Whitford. Randy's wife soon appears and Frank introduces Charlie. Frank then goes inside and starts shouting, calling for his brother. It's very much like, I'm here. You're getting this impression that maybe the family didn't want him to be there, but Frank is going to burst in and make himself known anyway. And Frank is also flirting with his brother's wife as well. He's being very charming, but also a bit leering as well. And Frank's brother asks him what's going on and who Charlie is, and in between all this, Frank throws his stick to Charlie to catch, but of course Charlie is not aware of this, and he misses, and he falls a nice little touch. Frank then starts talking to Randy, and he's being brash and loud, and it appears that Randy doesn't like it. He's making the whole family uncomfortable, really. And as they sit down at the dinner table after dinner, Frank is smoking and telling a dirty story, and his family are rolling their eyes. But Randy asks if Frank likes to shock people, and he starts questioning his life and raising his voice. But when Frank gets Randy's wife's name wrong, Frank says that she sounds unsatisfied, and he suggests that Randy should go down on her. It's a very blunt solution to that, but never mind. Charlie defends Frank, and Randy starts to talk about Frank's less than glowing military career, as he was passed over, and talked about how the accident happened where he lost his sight after he was juggling grenades. He says that Frank's partner in the axe died after Frank started pulling the pins, and all Frank lost was his sight. He says Frank's always been an arsehole, and when he calls Charles Chuck again, Frank throws himself into a rage and pins Randy against the wall. Frank then thanks his brother's wife for the dinner and says goodbye to his brother, leaning in to say that Frank thinks of himself as never being any good, and it's a sort of a way to apologise to him for what happened during the night. Frank and Charlie leave and they get in the car. Back at the hotel, Frank asks for a watch. Charlie says he doesn't have one, but Frank says he could use the clock. And in front of him, Frank has a disassembled gun and asks Charlie to time him to put it together. And as he does, it's very quick and it looks like he's been trained, and it's quite a skill, not just for a soldier, but for a blind man. He then asks Charlie what the time was, and he says he thinks about 30 seconds. And Charlie's starting to worry though, because Frank's got a gun in front of him, and considering what he told him he was going to do later, he's concerned. But Charlie then leaves the room, and Frank angrily calls him back in and says all he needs is another day with him. So it shows that Frank is preparing for what he wants to do, but he's still going to give himself enough time to make the most of his life, of what he's got left, or what he thinks. Charlie then says that he wants Frank to give him the weapon if he's going to stay another day. And Frank asks Charlie why he cares if he kills himself, and Charlie says he has a conscience. Frank then unloads a bullet in the gun because Charlie said that he'd taken his bullets away from him, but he left one in the chamber because he was not the military man that Frank is, and that he's able to do it. It's basically showing that you can keep an eye on him if you want to, but Frank will do what he wants to do eventually. In the barber shop in the hotel, Frank talks to Charlie about his problems at school, and he reaffirms that he's not a squealer. Frank says that there's more to life than just sticking to his ethics, and he says that Charlie will feel better if he tells the truth. Later on at the bar, Frank orders some drinks, and the barman asks for some ID because he thinks that Charlie is too young. Frank insists that Charlie is 23. Frank then asks if there's anyone in the restaurant that Charlie's got an eye on, and he says that he's seen a woman sitting alone. So, with a bit of encouragement, Frank and Charlie get up and they go over to speak to her. And this woman's name is Donna, and she's played by Gabrielle Amar. Frank talks to her and asks her if she's waiting for somebody, and he says that she should sit with them so that they can keep away the womanizers. She agrees and they sit, and Frank correctly identifies the soap that she's using. And this leads into the old cliche that if you lose one sense, then all the other senses are heightened. But for the sake of the plot, Frank gets it right, and Donna is impressed. Frank then introduces himself and Charlie, and Frank asks if this woman would like to tango. And she says she's always wanted to, but her boyfriend thinks that the dance is hysterical. Frank replies saying he thinks her boyfriend is hysterical. Frank then offers to teach her the tango. She's reluctant at first, but then she agrees and they get up. And Frank takes her hand and he asks Charlie where the dance floor is. So they step out onto the floor and take the positions, and they start dancing to the song. And if there's any scene that you would want to see in Sentimental Woman, it's this one. It's iconic. It's a really well done scene, and it's class. It's so classy. It's elegant and pure cinema. It's really great. And then at the end, when they finish the dance, the audience, the people around in the restaurant, start clapping. And they go back to sit down, and she compliments Frank on his dancing. And Charlie says he doesn't know how to dance. He's not really selling himself well. But anyway, then Donald's boyfriend turns up. And he shakes Frank's hand and Charlie's hand. And he says he's pleased that Donna got somebody to dance with. It's sort of funny how the boyfriend is so completely unaware. Back in the car, they're talking and Frank gets out as Charlie watches. Charlie then makes a call from the car and calls to George. Back in the car, they're talking and Frank gets out as Charlie watches. He then makes a call from the car and calls George. But somebody else picks up the phone and says that George is going to the airport. He talks to George, who says that he's decided to go home. George says he's going to talk to his father to sort it out, and it feels very much like Charlie's been left to face the music by himself. They get back into the car, and Frank remarks at how beautiful the woman was that they met, and he's not wrong. In the hotel room, Charlie comes into Frank's room, and he's lying in bed with his eyes open, and he's fully awake. Frank tells Charlie that he's depressed and that he still wants to kill himself, but Charlie says that they should go for a ride instead. Cut to a Ferrari showroom, and the salesman is nervous to let them go for a test drive because Charlie is so young and inexperienced, but Frank assures him that he'll be with him. But I think that the salesman can see that Frank is blind, and so it's not exactly making him feel a lot better. So Frank takes him to one side, and as he senses that the salesman is a man of a similar age to his. He sort of relates to him, he understands how it is with him, and he also slips him $2,000. In the next scene, Charlie's driving and he's struggling with the car. He's never driven a Ferrari before. He's not making the most of his experience, and despite the fact that Frank is instructing him, it's clear that Frank isn't getting the experience that he wanted. So, ensuring that they're on a quiet road, Frank gets behind the wheel as Charlie tells him to keep straight. And then Frank makes the car go faster and faster. This is the experience that Frank wanted, and he's doing it on his own terms. But Charlie is panicking. But Frank is still having a great time, and he starts laughing as they're speeding through the streets. And he challenges Charlie to tell him what direction to go in. They speed around the corner, and while Frank is having the time of his life, they get pulled over by a police car. The officer gets out and he asks for the license registration, but Frank says they're going for a test drive and that the license is back at the dealer. The officer hasn't really twigged that Frank is blind either. But Frank charms the police officer, and eventually the police officer says he's going to let him go. And Frank asks if the police officer's ever served, and the police officer said he's been in the Coast Guard. That's about as close as he's ever got. And Frank tries to restrain himself from making fun of him. But then, as the policeman leaves, Charlie and Frank swap seats, and as they go back, Frank's mood goes down again, and he realising that the fun is over. They make their way back, and Frank says it's taking too long. So he uses his cane to feel the way, and he walks out into the middle of the traffic. And as he gets across successfully, with Charlie clamouring after him, trying to make sure that he doesn't get run over. But when they get to the other side, Frank trips over, and Charlie has to help him get back up again, and they go back to the hotel room. Back at the hotel, Charlie wants to use the phone, and he calls George's home. And George's father answers the phone and says he won't be talking to his friends for a while. And he introduces himself as George Sr., as Frank had predicted. It seems like George Jr. has got into a bit of trouble, and his father isn't too pleased. Frank says he wants to take a nap, and he asks Charlie to go downstairs and get him some cigars. But while Charlie's downstairs, it dawns on him that Frank may have needed an excuse to be alone. So Charlie goes back upstairs, and he sees Frank putting on his armour uniform, and he has a gun. And this is, again, another big scene. Frank is on the verge of ending his life, and it goes back and forth between him and Charlie, and Frank even points the gun at Charlie and saying he's going to kill him because he can't bear the thought of Charlie setting out. And then there's a bit of a struggle, and as Frank puts the gun to his head, Charlie lunges forward and does a struggle, but there's a struggle, and Charlie manages to talk Frank down by saying that they should both go because they both made mistakes. But Charlie says that Frank can't make his mistakes rule his life, and Frank reminds Charlie that he's blind and that he can't see anything, so he feels like his life is over. But I'll talk a bit about that in a bit, about what I really think is happening with the film and Frank's character. And as they sit down, Frank starts to talk about the one thing that's kept him going all these years, but he's stopped. But then Charlie does want to know what he wanted to say, and Frank says he just wants to be with a beautiful woman. He just wants their company, really. But Charlie then says, well, Frank's a good-looking and fun guy. he can do what it'll be fine and everything. But Frank senses that Charlie might be making fun of him, and Charlie says it's a good moment. It's a very intense scene, this, but it ends well, and as the phone rings, Charlie picks it up and he's confused because he thought that the plane wasn't booked for later. And I mean, all of this has happened before Charlie's flight was even going to take off. But Frank says he always booked the airplane and he's going to help Charlie go back to uni. They get into the car and Frank senses Charlie's mood again. He tells Frank about the call with George's father, and Frank then asks Charlie about his own father and says that his father left, but he's got a stepfather, but he's an arsehole and don't get along. And Frank says it's okay, every family has an arsehole, and I think he's referring to himself. They go back to uni and Charlie knocks on the window to say goodbye, and Frank gives him some money for his services, and then rubs his hand over Charlie's face as a last way of saying he wants to remember him because he hasn't been able to see what he looks like. And now we unfortunately come to something which is perhaps the most common cliche of the portrayals of blind people in cinema, and that's face touching. Blind people don't touch other people's faces to get an image of their minds of what a person looks like. They just don't. Unless you're very highly attuned to translating a three-dimensional image from what you feel to an idea in your mind of what an object or a person is, then it's completely pointless for a blind person to feel somebody's face. A blind person probably has no reason to want to know what another person may look like for a number of reasons, the main one being that they cannot see. That would be like a wheelchair user wanting to know what it's like to climb a mountain, because they know they wouldn't be able to do it like an undisabled person would. So why bother? Over the years it's become a common shorthand for a filmmaker to show that a blind person wants to know what somebody may look like so that they can fully form an emotional connection. In reality though, a blind person will be able to form an emotional connection to somebody just fine without having to touch the person that they're talking to. When you think about it, the act of touching somebody else's face is just weird anyway. Frank and Charlie have barely known each other, and this seemingly last act of emotional connection could get very awkward very quickly. For the audience, it's meant to be a touching moment of two men bonding over a weekend. However, for the characters, and in particular Charlie, it would only emphasise Frank's disability and not be a reflection on him as a person. He's never had to feel somebody's face to know what kind of person they are so far, so why choose this moment? John heads back to uni where the process is going on, and the other boys are there, and Charlie steps up into a chair and he sits down. And it's like a witness stand. I don't know about this kind of a situation, whether this is a thing that happens in these kind of schools, but it looks like a court procedure, and all the other students are there, and on the other side is George sitting at a similar table, and there's a man sitting next to him, and it appears that this is George Senior, and he's played by Baxter Harris. Mr. Trask stands at a lectern and starts making a speech about why he's doing all this because of the slipping standards at the school. It's nothing to do with him being humiliated or thinking that he has some kind of elevated authority because of who he is and what karma he's got. No, nothing to do with that at all. Then Frank and his driver arrive in the room. Charlie goes over to ask what happened, and he brings Frank up to sit with him. Mr. Trask then asks Frank who he is, and Frank tells him about their relationship with Charlie. Mr. Trask then turns to question George. He said he didn't see anything because of the contact. He didn't have his contact lenses in. And George is clearly making fun of Mr. Trask because he thinks that this is a ridiculous proceeding, and he's got a rich family, he'll be fine. But he also names all the boys that he saw doing the thing. And Mr. Charleston turns to Charlie, asking him who he saw. And Charlie says that he can't be sure, and he couldn't say, but he also says that he saw somebody, but says it could have been any of the students. Mr. Trask says he has no other choice but to expel Charlie. But this causes Frank to speak up. He says Charlie isn't a snitch. He says the motto of the school should be that you should tell on people or face the consequences. He says Charlie is the only innocent person in there. He says he'd rather burn the place down if he was there 5 years ago, because people only look out for themselves. He says there's he's seen a lot of things in the army, but there's nothing worse than an amputated spirit, and that's what he thinks that they're trying to do to Charlie. He tells the boys by name to go fuck themselves, and he says that Charlie has the integrity and spirit and courage because he won't sell anybody out. He says that he's good character and principle, and the committee shouldn't destroy somebody like that because Charlie has a bright future. And this is a big, rousing speech. This is one of perhaps 3 scenes in the film that probably won Al Pacino the Oscar. And this is such a big thing. And as the speech ends, the audience applauds, and George gives an expression enthusiastic that his days are numbered. And I mean, it's such a little incident on the scale of things. The teacher gets a prank played on him and his car gets ruined and he takes vindictive, petty revenge. But the whole court proceeding is like, it's like court. And having the audience applaud like this shows that they're all really invested in what's going on, and I really don't think they should be, because they just want to go home, probably, majority of them. They don't care, they just want to get it over with, but something in what Frank said has roused them and made them feel good about themselves. And it's a bit of a cliche, but it's the highest moment of the film. Mr. Charleston bangs his gavel and calls to order and consults with the rest of the committee. Mrs. Hunsaker comes to the lectern and says that the boys who did the prank will be punished, and George will be let go, and Charlie will not face any further punishment. The crowd cheers and applauds as they're so incredibly invested in this little incident, and the music rises triumphantly. Outside, Charlie's leading Frank back to the car, where a woman from the committee comes up to say how much she admires that Frank came to stand up for Charlie. He asks her if she's married, and he says that they should try and talk politics sometime. And he walks off with Charlie, and before Charlie starts to talk about what she's like, Frank describes her perfectly, because he's psychic. They go back to the car, and Frank thanks the driver, saying he's going to pay him more. And Frank says Charlie should drop by and have dinner sometime. Frank goes back home, and the kids are all there, and he talks to them, and as Charlie watches Frank and getting on with the kids, Charlie gets back into the car, and Frank calls out for his niece to make some hot chocolate. So that's the end of Sentimental Woman. Up next, I'll be talking a bit more about my overall general views of the film and what I think it means for the non-disabled audience who'll be watching Frank and Al Pacino's performance. Sentimental Woman has all the elements of the perfect Oscar-winning movie. A mismatched partnership who eventually learn to bond and learn from each other, a handful of dramatic and comedic scenes, and a triumphant scene at the end where the audience could punch the air. However, its depiction of a blind person could be a little more nuanced and slightly better researched. Despite Frank's overall storyline being that he wants to end his life because he's lost his sight, the audience is never truly let in on the reason why Frank may want to do so. To those paying attention, though, it becomes clear. Frank is looked down on by his family. His niece treats him like a child who needs to be looked after, and the rest of his family are embarrassed and look down on him because of his personality. to the point where his nephew even says that certain people deserve to go blind. Add to that the fact that Frank thinks he will never form a proper relationship with a woman, and you get a more rounded picture. I just hope the audience will get the message that there is life after the disability. Okay, so up next, let's talk about the trivia. Okay, firstly I can tell you that Al Pacino would often remain in character off set, using his cane to walk and never looking at anyone when they talked to him. He was helped by a school for the blind in his preparation for the role. He said that he made himself appear blind by not allowing his eyes to focus on anything. Apparently he refocused his eyes, therefore blurring up his vision, and left him temporarily blind. Al Pacino originally turned down the lead, and Jack Nicholson, Harrison Ford, Dustin Hoffman and Joe Pesci were considered. On his agent's advice, though, Pacino reluctantly accepted the role. He later gave his agent credit on Inside the Actors Studio in 1994 for making him reconsider taking the part. According to Al Pacino, his use of the word hoo-ah was inspired by the Armed Forces consultant for the movie who had to teach him how to assemble and disassemble his weapons in under 45 seconds. He said it took him a long time to learn it, and whenever he nailed it particularly well, the consultant would yell, "Hoo-ah!" And hoo-ah is an actual United States Army battle cry, although Al Pacino is saying it wrong. He places far too much emphasis on the "w" sound in the second syllable. The real version is closer to hoo-ah, not hoo-ah, as he says in the movie. The term derives from the military HUA, which stands for Heard, Understood, Acknowledged. This is a standard response by soldiers when given orders by the superior. Philip Seymour Hoffman auditioned for the role 5 times before it was cast. He was working various odd jobs in between sporadic film and TV roles, stacking shelves at a Manhattan deli before he was cast. Hoffman cited this film as the film that changed everything for his career. Stephen Dorff, Chris Strone, Corey Feldman and Leonardo DiCaprio all auditioned for the part of Charlie, as did Ben Affleck, Matt Damon, Brendan Fraser, Cole Hauser, Randall Batinkoff and Anthony Rapp. And in the same year, all those actors and Chris O'Donnell would star in School Ties, with a plot that also revolves around a preparatory school. James Cromwell was considered for the role of Mr. Trask. Scenes showing the audience at the Baird School and depicting it as an all-male boarding school were filmed at the Emma Willard School, one of the oldest all-female boarding schools in the country. Al Pacino and Gabrielle Anwar rehearsed their tango for 2 weeks, and the scene took 3 days to shoot. In addition to winning the Best Actor Oscar, Al Pacino was also nominated for Best Supporting Actor for Glengarry Glen Ross in the same year. And it was the only Best Picture nominee not nominated in either of the supporting categories for that year. Frankie Charlie's driver of the limousine is called Manny, as well as Manilow. Al Pacino's left hand in the movie Scarface was also called Manny and Manilow. According to an interview with Conan O'Brien in 1997, Sylvester Stallone said that he turned down the role of Frank Slade. Al Pacino's monologue about women was sampled by R&B on their 1995 track Passport to Heaven. The radio edit only uses the line "Women, what can you say?" and Passport to Heaven, while the album version starts with the full speech. Gabrielle Anwar played a lead role as a blind person in Wild Hearts Can't Be Broken in the year previously. When Lieutenant Colonel Frank Slade takes exception to Charlie excusing a salute, he admonishes his young companion that this bat has sharper radar than the Nautilus. "Don't F with me, Charlie." While the USS Nautilus, the nuclear submarine, came equipped with radar, bats do not have radar. Bats and submarines both rely on the use of sonar to move through the world, not radar. And I guess the same could be said for blind people. Chris O'Donnell and Gabrielle Anwar also appeared in The Three Musketeers the year later, and I'd recommend it just for Tim Curry's performance alone. And finally, It was reported that in order to make Chris O'Donnell cry during the scene where Charlie is trying to stop Frank from killing himself, Al Pacino had to take him aside and scream at him like a drill sergeant. Okay, that's it for this week. Next week I'll be talking about Rain Man, the Oscar-winning movie starring Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman about a man who reconnects with his autistic older brother. If you'd like to contact me, you can do so via Bluesky at bluesky.com/film-ability. You can also email me at film-ability@outlook.com. And if you'd like to make a contribution to the things that I do here, you can find me at Patreon at patreon.com/film-ability. You can also find my book at Amazon on Kindle and paperback called Film Ability, A History of Disability in Cinema. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.